That's the preacher bag from the hospital.
Okay, well, I'm going to put it up.
In case I have to do any departures there. Um, where we are right now, my family is very old in this country. We were here before it was a country. Benjamin Ring hosted George Washington in his home and fought with him at the Battle of Brandywine, which was part of the Revolutionary War. And the Rings, who was a part of the family my dad always identified with, in the 1840s came out here. And Ralph Ring, finding the remains of ancient Indian fires on this spot, decided that this was a place to build a home. To the left we have the Coon Path, which is the natural line of drift between the Eel and White River, and was used by the Indians to take their furs to the river docks at Gosport. Behind me we have Molly's Branch. Nobody knows who Molly is, okay? But she was got a stream named after her, Molly's Branch. Over there we have Mill Creek, where Ralph built an actual mill. And the bend where Molly's Branch meets Mill Creek is called Juanit's Hole, after Juanit Ring, who was a crazy woman who lived in this cabin at one point and used to shoot at the people that would fish on her fishing bank there. We had a bunch of interesting folks out here. And Ralph, of course, had the misfortune that he had one son, his oldest, and after that ran to girls, and there were 7. And those 7 girls, fortunately, there was another family back in this area, the Logans, and they had 7 boys. And so it was just naturally assumed that the Ring girls would marry the Logan boys, and this happened up until the Civil War, when Matthias Ring, Ralph's son, followed his colors off to Vicksburg, where he fell and remained. And Ralph, having no one to leave his property to, decided that Sarah and Jake should not be married. The problem being, with the lack of recreational activity and the thickness of the woods around here, Sarah was already with child. So the decision was made that the child would be given to Ralph, and Ralph raised that child as his own, Morton Ring. So when they talk about if your family tree don't fork, out here we have bushes, all right? And you're never exactly sure what branch you're on. My father always used to tell me, don't talk about the people in town, you're probably related to them. And that's so far has been the case. Morton Ring was a worker in wood and stone and a bit of an innovator. He had one of the first cars around here anywhere. It was an old Maxwell, and he used to like to drive up and down these gravel roads chewing tobacco, much to the consternation of his wife, Sally Ring, who used to, as she had always been raised riding in a wagon, ride behind him, as that's where the ladies used to ride. And he would drive down the road spitting tobacco out the side. Sally was not a happy girl. It's okay, Morton built the house over where, we've seen where Dad lived. And this cabin was still up then. I had Mary Serber come out, who was one of the very old ladies in the area many years ago, who was the last person who had seen this cabin standing, and explained to me exactly where everything was. And these are, of course, the old foundation stones that we can see projecting out of the ground. They were hand quarried at Ramona Quarry and brought here in a wagon. And that's where the first cabin was raised. Morton Ring, who lived across the holler, had a daughter. Her name was Mabel, and she's his youngest daughter. And Mabel, during the First World War, sewed coats for the soldiers overseas. And as was the habit at the time, she placed a letter in the pockets of the coats that she'd sewed. And one of these letters found its way to a young soldier fighting in France, Paul Elder, my grandfather. And Paul, reading this letter, wrote back to her, and upon his being struck by lightning and injured overseas, he came back here, and with $35 of his mustered out pay got off at the train station down at Spencer, when there was a train station in Spencer, and married her. That was my grandfather. My father was born on this land into what can only be described as crushing poverty. The people here lived off the land. They ate what it was that they could farm or what it was that they could shoot in these woods. And at that time you could buy shotgun shells one at a time because people couldn't afford an entire box. So my dad seldom missed, and he taught me to shoot in these woods and taught me to never miss. There's a million stories about this place. Right over there is a place where a raccoon grabbed him by the thumb, threw 2 pair of gloves because he used to trap furs to get his school clothes. And it bit his thumb and he couldn't reach a branch to hit it with, and it was on a chain, and it must have been interesting. I know how it turned out because that raccoon bought him his clothes for that year. He used to take the furs down to the fur market at Spencer where they'd lay them out on the courthouse grounds, and the buyers from Indianapolis and from Bloomington would come over and look at the furs. And sometimes they didn't get much, sometimes they got a lot. Dad trapped a 28-inch mink, which is the biggest mink that we've seen around here anywhere. These are some of the mink that he actually trapped up on his monument here that he had made into a fur piece for my grandmother, which she never wore because she thought it would be presumptuous in putting herself forward. So it hung in the closet forever. And so they're joining us today. We can also say that when my dad was out here, it was unusual to have a lot of children make it out of infancy. The infant mortality rate was huge, and my father was the only surviving child of 4 that were born to Mabel and Paul. They rest with their parents down at Spencer Cemetery, but he was the only one that made it out in infancy, and you had to be strong. I mean, and he was he was a strong man. He used to have a great love of education and scholarship, and he was the first man that ever in our family went to college. He used to pitch hay for a fellow up the road that had no sons and had a big farm and some money, and he lent my dad the money to go to school until he was able to get a scholarship, and he was the independent student body president at Purdue University, class of 1942. The class of 1942, of course, was the beginning of the Second World War. My father volunteered immediately, but the military came to all the colleges and they said, if you finish out the semester and graduate, it would help us tremendously because we don't have the guns to train you right now. Those were some fairly desperate times, but Dad, his first deployment was to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, where he fell in love with the land up there and the people, and he served in the Aleutian Islands campaign. And later with the Army Air Corps at Edgewood Arsenal and at Washington, D.C. He came back here to sell war bonds, being one of the local boys that made good, and people still remember that. People still speak to me about that. My father, when he got out of the military, became involved with the National Association of Home Builders and was their convention and exposition manager, and met my mother, Nan Murphy, who was an airline stewardess. And an Army Air Corps officer and an airline stewardess were as hot as it got back then, okay? And I don't know much about it, but I saw them dance one time, and damn could they dance. So, my father raised his family, his daughter Jane, who's with me here tonight, sister Sally, and he has grandchildren as well. And when he knew that he was getting cancer, he had to leave this place. We're 45 minutes from the nearest hospital here, and it just wouldn't have been doable. And Jane and our family down in Frisco, Texas, were there to assist him in his last days. But until then, he walked this land every day of his life. He fed the birds. And so I was thinking that there were a lot of things that I could do, because that's how I always remember him, is back here walking around talking to the creatures and feeding the birds. And I know that his wish that he stated to me was, he said he'd like to fall off his tractor and be eaten by possums. And there's rules against that. You know, we couldn't do that for him. So what I've done instead is I've made him something here that he can feed the birds. Josephine, my wife, who was his best buddy in his last years out here and cooked for him every night, and rubbed the Native American voodoo cream in his legs so that he could keep on walking. Her and her folks have sent us some beautiful things, and but this is not Native American. This is just what happens when you give a redneck a chainsaw and too much time to think about things. And I know that I believe Dad would like it. So I'm going to put him here. I'm going to put him here with his with the bird seed, the last of his bird seed that he held out in his back ring. Okay. And we'll let his friends scatter him. Okay, they'll be here in the morning, and there's a salt block here for his deer. And they'll put him back in this place better than I can. Can you hand me that knife off that stone? It's my trusted knife, and I left it sitting. Okay. So I'm going to commit him to this place in the sure and certain hope of the resurrection. And Josephine made me this for when I have to do the hospital thing. But I'm not going to sit here and wear out Paul of Tarsus. Instead, Josephine and her people have sent us a sentiment. I can't read it. I've asked a friend to go ahead and read it.
Grandfathers, Mitakwé Oyasin, once more behold me here on earth, and lean in close to hear my feeble voice. I am asking you to welcome Damon and show him the way beyond the pine trees at the end of this world. Light him a star in the sky, and with a soft breeze take him west so he can join you in the thunder where his soul will be a part of all living things. This is his body which I cared for. These are boots which I followed. These are his stories which I remember. This is his voice that I talk with. These are his hands I use to write with. Grandfathers, Mitakwé Oyasin, and Damon, hear the sacred voice and follow it, knowing that you will be with your ancestors and mine. Those of us that remain in this world, you have blessed, and we are not crying for you because you are in all things now. We know we will see you again, as a shadow that runs across the grass, and a deer that stops to feed, and in this sacred place where your people lived. Grandfathers, Mitakwé Oyasin and Damon, you are the love and beauty we walk with into old age, and know you will be there to greet me at the edge of the world beyond the pine trees. Until that time, I continue to remember and love you in all things. With my earthly life, I will honor yours. With the people you love, I will love. With your knowledge, I will share. As a relative of all things living and dead, I thank you.
I think I'm just going to stay here for a little while. Anybody who cares to can stay with me. I know Adam was good enough to come, and he's got to probably go back and save some folks because there's no adult supervision on the ICU. Their A-team is all here. So, but I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I think Dad would have liked this. Like I said, you know, it's not Machu Picchu, but and he'll be here forever now.
He's absolutely gorgeous.